you for everybody for coming along and listening. So I'd like to just talk you through the webinar tonight. So yeah, I've been working in this area for 20 years, and I suppose I got really excited about cancer because I feel as nutritional therapists we can really make an impact, which came as a surprise to me as well when I first started out. So I'm just going to move on to our first slide. So when I'm seeing my breast cancer patients, I like to do a lot of testing. So particularly looking at what could potentially be driving it. I mean, certainly hormones are a major issue, but it's still good to look at other aspects as well, including toxins, so things like heavy metals. Amalgam fillings are an obvious one, but they're not the only kind of issues that can occur. So I like to look at mycotoxins. I like to look at DNA adducts, so toxins that are bound to a person's genes, and hence they are turning on oncogenes, cancer-causing genes, or suppressing tumor suppressor genes. We also like to look at viruses as well. Other issues like mycotoxins, so we can sort of go into the whole array of all the different things, all the different insults that can be causing problems. Look at diet, look at deficiencies, and stress is another major thing. So sort of in the end, it becomes a very sort of personalized approach. So no sort of breast cancer patient has the same protocol. So here, we've just sort of basically summarized some of the things we're looking at. So we're looking at hormones, we're looking at also reducing inflammation, we're testing for those very specific toxins, and then we're really also working on immunity, because in an ideal world, your immune cells, particularly your natural killer cells, should be stopping cancerous cells developing, because we'll have a few cancerous cells, but your natural killer cells should be coming along and really attacking rapidly dividing cells, so that they never get a proper footing in the body. So really looking at what's going on with those natural killer cells as well, and what could be potentially suppressing them. Could it be viruses? Could it be bacteria? So I'd like to sort of talk a bit about breasts, as we're specifically talking about breast cancer. Just like to think, what do breasts mean to us? I mean, there are many things. A means to feed infants, sexual organs, an inspiration for classical artists. Some people might take a very pragmatic approach and think they're just two lumps of lymphatic tissue. And also, for some people, it is the location of their malignancy. So there are many different types of breast cancer. There's ductal carcinoma in situ, where the cancer cells are just found around the milk ducts. And then there's the more invasive form of ductal carcinoma, where the cancer cells have gone beyond the milk ducts. And this is the most common type of breast cancer. And then there's lobular carcinoma in situ, where abnormal cells are only found in the lobules. The lobules are the glands that form milk, breast milk. And then, of course, there is invasive lobular carcinoma, where the cancer has started in the lobules but spread to other parts of the breast. Then there's also inflammatory breast cancer, and this is slightly different because there's a swelling and a reddening of the breast tissue rather than a distinct lump. So it's slightly different, and certainly with that type of breast cancer, you really want to get in there, really drive those inflammatory markers down and get the anti-inflammatory agents working for any lady who presents in that way. And then there is metastatic breast cancer, where it has spread to different sites beyond the breast themselves. And the most common route, or the route that pretty much all my patients go down who are unfortunate enough to have metastatic breast cancer, is the lymph nodes in the armpit. So, and often those lymph nodes will be taken out and examined to see what the spread is. And of course, those lymph nodes are very close to breast tissue. And then we can move to other parts as well from that point. A really key thing with the breast, the tissue in the armpit, I'm very kind of keen to get people off of deodorants that have aluminium in, because we really want to protect those lymph nodes, and we don't want more toxins being taken up by the lymph nodes. So I'm very keen to get people on very clean deodorants, maybe crystal deodorant, use those, so deodorant crystals, or ones that definitely do not have aluminium, and you have to sort of make a concerted effort to find those. And there also there are other types of breast cancer which are not so common, but still they are there. Triple negative breast cancer, that also can raise its ugly head, and that tends to affect younger women under 50, and 10 to 20% of women may have triple negative breast cancer. And what that means is that it's not fed by estrogen, it's not progesterone receptive, and it's not HER2 positive. So there are no HER2 proteins that are feeding that breast cancer. So then it's very necessary to look at some of those other toxins that could be feeding it, and that you know, I would definitely do a DNA adduct test for a lady presenting in that way. And then there is also male breast cancer, and this is usually ductal carcinomas. It doesn't come up that often, but it still can present itself. But overall, 70 to 80% of breast cancer is hormone receptive, and it's really estrogen driving the cancer cells. And that's really important to emphasize, because often when women are told that they are their cancer is breast cancer is estrogen receptive and progesterone receptive, it raises a lot of anxiety also about progesterone, especially when I say, oh, you know, you could use some progesterone cream, and they say, oh, well, my cancer is progesterone receptive. And that's a very reasonable question to, or a very reasonable point to make. And but although where breast cancer might be progesterone receptive, it doesn't mean that progesterone is actually feeding it. It just means there are receptor sites for progesterone. Progesterone is really lovely because it has many roles in this situation. It is a bit of an antidote to this overriding estrogen, so it helps to reduce estrogen dominance by just balancing things out. It's really good also for any sort of menopausal symptoms as well. It helps to reduce those, even if it's just like a very kind of false menopause, where, you know, it's just a drug-induced one that's a natural menopause. But so progesterone is very useful in that respect. And it's also really protective of the bones and helps to boost the osteoblasts, which are the bone building cells of the body, which is really important if you're put on tamoxifen or letrozole. So if you're on sort of drugs that damp down your estrogen levels, because then that can to an extent undermine bone density. So it's nice to have something as an antidote like progesterone. And the lovely thing about progesterone cream as well is it really helps to encourage cell apoptosis and renewal. So it very much is our friend. Yeah, so I'd just like to look in more detail at some of the things that I have found. So certainly heavy metals are a big one, and it's good to ask the person if they have amalgam fill-ins, on whether it's something they could think about removing in a very safe way. I really like to use things like chlorella and also coriander to help support people when they're having their mercury fillings removed. Or even if they think, well, at the moment I've got too much on, I just can't face it, or I can't afford it, then still you can still protect them, or go some way to protect them by using those kind of agents. And things like zeolite are also really good at knocking out mercury. And also aluminium is a big one. So aluminium from cooking pots, from foil, all really all common issues, all common sort of sites of, all common sources of aluminium that people will be exposed to. So I usually like people to sort of get rid of the aluminium-based deodorants, get rid of the cooking pots, get rid of the tin foil, and go for sort of glass cookware, which you can get from places like IKEA and Wayfair. I also like people to protect themselves from cadmium. An obvious source is going to be, well, some of it is batteries, but another obvious source is smoking, and it could just be a passive smoker, and of course lead. Lead is stored very readily in the bone, so it can displace calcium and some of the bone building minerals. So if you're also on things like letrozole or tamoxifen, then you really don't want high levels of lead also undermining bone density. So it is helpful to look at SNPs and gene deletions. So do you see many of those, sometimes glutathione deletions, vitamin D receptors that are undermined. So I do see quite a lot of that. People with many problems with various detoxification pathways due to SNPs. And I found, I really like the detoxigenomic test that Genova do. I do like to test for glyphosate if it's appropriate. You know, if people say, well, it always crop spraying where I live, so it is good to look at, or even if people are gardeners who use Roundup in their garden, it's good to look for glyphosate. And there's a good test that Biolab do. I do like to look for oncoviruses as well. I see sky-high levels of Epstein-Barr virus active rather than the latent form, and things like herpes simplex 1 and 2, HHV6. I tend to like to use the ELI spots because, which Almond Labs do, because these ELI spots are very sensitive. They're more sensitive than antibody tests, so you can often pick up viruses and bacteria that which may not be picked up, you know, particularly if the immune system is undermined and the body isn't very readily making antibodies. I tend to do provoked tests as well, so I get people to take hyaluronic acid 10 days before they do the blood test. Inflammation, you can, oops, sorry, I'm just missing up the slides here. It's going to be that. Yes, so inflammation, it's not always readily picked up. You can look at things like C-reactive protein, but sometimes it can be more subtle. You know, sometimes it doesn't mean, often there aren't sky-high white blood cells. sometimes CRP isn't raised. So those ordinary routes of inflammation are not always picked up. It probably would be good to do a stool test to see if there's any issues there, even though it may seem that it's not directly related to breast cancer. I do think it's good to have a multifactorial approach and look at everything. And it's great to also look at whether the immune system is impaired in any way. So an ordinary full blood cell count is helpful, but then there are more detailed tests. There's a lovely test that Alma Labs do where it measures CD3, CD57, and CD56. So these are all different types of natural killer cells that can be readily measured. And CD56 is a lovely generic, natural killer cell, which is very relevant to cancer patients. And CD57 is very cytotoxic, can be undermined by bacteria. CD57 can very much be undermined, sorry, CD3 can very much be undermined by viruses, so it's always good to know what's going on with those three markers. They are very specific types of natural killer cells. And an ordinary full blood cell count will not tell you anything about your natural killer cells. So other things I like to look at are DNA adducts, which IGL labs now look at. They're a German lab. Acumen Labs used to do it. They no longer do it as far as I know. So IGL Labor is fantastic just for seeing what toxins are actually affecting your genes. So without further ado, I'd like to just talk a little bit about genetic mutations. You've probably heard a lot about the BRCA1 gene and how it predisposes people to developing breast cancer. So BRCA1, you have a 55 to 65% chance of developing breast cancer, and the BRCA2 increases it by 45%. I still feel that, if you are positive for that, I think it's good to know that, even though it might be a bit disconcerting, because there's so many ways you can sort of manage your genes and sort of protect yourself. So 1 in 400 or 0.25% carry the mutated BRCA1 gene or BCR2 gene. So it just means that gene becomes damaged and is no longer effective at repairing broken DNA made in the prevention of breast cancer. So I'd like to talk about DNA adducts because I've actually found looking at DNA adducts a really good way of personalizing the approach. And I found many things. I found many things when I've been looking at the various adducts. And some of the common things that have come up are copper, right, some of the common things that have come up is copper, and also things like nickel. Copper is particularly found in women, and I've had someone where the copper is like spilling out of them. So, and has formed a DNA adduct and is switching on various genes. So, very keen to address that. And the obvious thing you might think is to use zinc to mop up excess copper, but it's not ideal in this situation. I'm very stingy with zinc. I tend to use kids' dosages of zinc, just because zinc is a very potent tissue promoter. So with cancer, you don't really want to be using too much of it. So I would be any of these heavy metals, I've really been trying to mop it up with zeolite, with a food-based selenium, glutathione, liposomal or reduced, just really trying to mop it up that way. Hair dye, again, is a common issue, and I'd very much like to get women using natural hair dyes like Aveda, so that they're not taking on toxins from the more commonly purchased hair dye, because that can be very cytotoxic. I have found petrochemicals and benzene. I have found nitrosamines as well. So nitrosamines are found in many sources, from cured meats to condoms of all things, and balloons. So nitrosamines are very much an issue. You can still have your bacon. You know that you can get bacon that doesn't have nitrosamines. Naked bacon, so people can still have some of the things they enjoy without putting themselves in danger. And again, I'd very much be careful of detergent, so use the natural ones like Ecova, and there are others as well. And also triclosan, which is found in cosmetics and soaps and detergents. So very much go natural with all these things. I've also found things like dichlorobenzene, which is found a lot in toilet blocks, in also in mothballs, sorts of things. And lindane is an insecticide, so that comes up a lot. This is just giving you a sort of bit of a kind of quick sort of summary of some of the things I found. Melatonin is a really interesting one. There was a really big study involving nurses that were doing night shift, and they found that the women that were that had very low melatonin, much more at risk of developing breast cancer. And melatonin is useful anyway. It is directly cytotoxic to breast cancer cells, so it's a good thing to have. Also, it's good for cellular repair, and it works as a wonderful antioxidant. And also for mood as well, it will convert to serotonin in the daytime. So it has many, many uses. So I'm eager to kind of address that if that is an issue. It's not that easy to measure. I know the Dutch hormone test, they do measure melatonin levels. Very eager to reduce exposure to xenoestrogens as well. So, yeah, definitely to get people onto organic food to really reduce exposure and encourage these xenoestrogens to break down as well. So I do use progesterone cream to protect people from breast cancer. So I tend to suggest that people apply that. That's something easy and should be done. Also, I tend to encourage people to have the cruciferous vegetables steamed rather than raw. Get the fermented soya in, and also flaxseed to block the estrogen receptors. And eat organic, reduce excess weight. Excess weight is very estrogenic. And also avoid HRT or contraceptive pill. I do tend to use calcium glucarate to help the body detoxify from excess hormones, particularly those reproductive hormones and estrogen. I do use DIM and indole carbinol. And then looking at detoxification, so with mercury, which comes up a lot, obviously for issues with amalgam fillings, I use things like zeolite, I use chlorella, I do use nanocolloidal cilantro and chlorella. So I use a kind of array of things. Also, what can be helpful when sort of cleansing the body is to use hypothermia. That's a really good way of removing DNA adducts. And there's a wonderful paper that was, it's a wonderful piece of research that Professor Curry and Jean Monroe did about showing how hypothermia can remove DNA adducts. So mycotoxins, they do come up a lot. They can actually be carcinogenic. They can be immunotoxic, genotoxic, toxic to the kidneys. So I'm always eager to ask people about whether they've had exposure to water damaged buildings, other toxins. There are many different mycotoxins that can be made worse by a lot of EMF. So if you've got a moldy, damp wall, then don't have your Wi-Fi right next to it. But ideally, sort of, if you're in rented accommodation, it'd be great to move. And if you own the house, definitely get it sorted because it's highly toxic. And I use an array of different things to remove those mycotoxins. Zeolite is one, and Saccharomyces boulardii, Interface by Claire Labs, glutathione, Propolis vaporizers. There are many different approaches. And then I like to sort of come in quite strongly with things to really boost the immune system, such as Biobram, some of the medicinal mushrooms, some of which you can have as a food, and then also fermented food as well, so really boosting your immune system through your gut flora as well, and really regulating gene expression through your gut flora as well, because there's such a large genome within your gut that's which is belongs to your gut flora, that also has a profound effect on cancer progression. So I very much like to use lots of cleansing foods. So again, the cruciferous vegetables, limonene-rich foods, and chlorophyll-rich foods, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So really like to use things like the klamath algae, chlorella, barley grass, wheatgrass, sea vegetables, any of those things. Right, I really want to, I'm really eager to talk to you about immunity and inflammation, because that is an area I worked with for a long time and become really interested in. There's various different ways of looking at what's going on with your immunity. I do very much, as well as recommend any arming lab tests, I do recommend doing stool tests as well. Health Path do a really lovely one, which is so thorough, gives you so much information. You will really have no secrets after doing that test. I'm very interested in really working on inflammation levels, and I do use Biobram to reduce inflammation because it helps to reduce C-reactive protein. It does help to reduce other forms of inflammation, but probably C-reactive protein is the one that's of most interest to us in this situation. I also like to work on NF-kappa B, which is this inflammatory protein that can often be the driving force as well behind cancer progression. The NF-kappa B can be very much addressed by resveratrol, be it from a Japanese knotweed or from grape. I also use, in terms of immunity, I use selenium to really bolster neutrophils, which often are low. But then I like to really use the Biobram to specifically work on natural killer cells, and also to work on B lymphocytes T lymphocytes and macrophages. So I really like to come in with those with Biobran to support that aspect of people's health. The nice thing about Biobran as well is it will also help to boost the to really address and help to reduce the anti-apoptosis gene, the BCL2 gene. So Biobran, there are some interesting papers where it was found to reduce that. I also like to use things like vitamin D. A liquid vitamin D is wonderful because that, again, is really helpful for supporting immunity overall, protecting bones as well. And I like to use the carotenoids. And it can be with food, just really getting orange foods involved. I do like to use some medicinal mushrooms. Sometimes I might just use Biobran as my sort of main immune booster, but then certain medicinal mushrooms have other features. So things like cordyceps are great for boosting the uptake of oxygen, helping with breathing. So oxygenating the body is great because it creates a hostile environment for cancer development. Lion's mane is great for anyone that's got any kind of numbness due to chemotherapy. Then lion's mane is really lovely for nerve repair. It's also known as hericium. And I have used things like Micromax to really bolster the bowel flora. It's got over 80 different strains. It's the most full spectrum product that I have found, the most full spectrum probiotic I have found, massive prebiotics as well, rather than just one or two. So I'd like to talk to you in more detail about Biobran. It basically is derived from rice bran, but rice bran would ordinarily just go right through you, but in this case it doesn't when it's in the form of Biobran, because it's actually being broken down by an enzyme derived from shiitake mushroom called carbohydrase. So, and that basically is what Biobran is. So it's then able to actually, Biobran is then able to actually go into your small intestine, where it then goes through the wall of the small intestine into the bloodstream, where it's able to stimulate the activity of natural killer cells. And that's a problem. Often, people with cancer might have the same amount of natural killer cells as other people, but their natural killer cells have got their feet up going, nothing to do, nothing to do, nothing to do. And all these cancer cells are developing in an uncontrolled fashion. And when they've analysed natural killer cells of people that go on to develop cancer, they have a lot more suppressor receptor sites rather than stimulator receptor sites. So we just need to change the nature of the natural killer cells. And I find Biobran really helpful for that. Just kind of makes your natural killer cells much more like a fighting kind of animal to protect you. Biobran is also really lovely in that it helps to regulate cytokines. So it stimulates some of the ones that you really want to stimulate, like interleukin-2, which is really important to help protect you from cancer and other chronic illnesses. But it helps to regulate and sometimes dampen down things like interleukin-6, which is very pro-inflammatory, and interleukin-10. So, but what's really lovely about the way that Biobran is able to stimulate interleukin-2 is that it does it in a way that doesn't cause side effects, whereas some of the sort of some of the prescription drugs that will boost interleukin-2 can be quite hard on the kidneys, can cause you to lose magnesium as well. So Biobran doesn't do that. And it's very easily absorbed. So even if the immune system is compromised, even if digestion is compromised due to chemotherapy, or it has a very low molecular weight, just 30,000 to 50,000 Daltons. So it's really lovely from that point of view. I really like this study. It's got nothing to do with anybody who, it's a completely independent study, but nothing to do with anyone developing a product. But it looked at 3,625 Japanese men and women over an 11-year period. And what it did was it divided everybody up to see who had the lowest natural killer cells. And so all those people who were in the group had the lowest natural killer cells compared to the groups that had the highest natural killer cells were then revisited. And what they found was they looked at men, they looked at women, that women had double the amount of cancer diagnosed if they were in the group with the lowest amount of natural killer cells than those with reasonable amount of natural killer cells. And men had a third more cancer diagnosis. And originally, at the beginning of those 11 years, none of those people actually had, none of those people had cancer. And there's a wonderful study that Takahara did where he looked at some quite advanced cancer patients, stage 3 and stage 4, and 209 people. And he, again, got really good results with those people that he administered Biobrand to, a real improvement. I'll go into, I can always go into more detail. I can always send you the paper. You just need to contact the Really Healthy Company and they will send you the paper next. It makes really interesting reading. When they've gone into more detail, they have found that Biobrand has really bolstered NK cell expansion and also helped to switch on the activator receptors, the CD25 and CD69 by a huge amount, by 80%. Also found other activator receptors were also really stimulated. So in DNAM, NKP30 and NKG2D. So I'd like to look at some very specific papers. There's an interesting paper by Professor Gonum, who helped develop Biobrand initially, and this was published in Anti-Cancer Research 2014. And he was actually looking at paclitaxel, which is a drug that's commonly administered to breast cancer patients, and he found that it's certainly when paclitaxel and Biobrand were taken together, it really worked very well synergistically. And what it did was it sensitized the breast cancer cells to paclitaxel by about 100-fold. So it was a huge increase. And they looked at two different cell lines. They looked at non-metastatic cell line, and then they also looked at a metastatic breast cancer cell line. So they looked at the two, and they got good results with both. So that was quite interesting. And another study that I thought, though it is a in vivo study, but it is a mouse study, but it was quite interesting in that it was looking at irradiated mice. So really looking at what effect could Biobrand have. Could it be at all protective of people having radiation? So obviously looking at mice initially, and it found that it was really helpful for protecting the blood-forming tissues and organs of the body, and really found that it was able to protect the body in that way. Because ordinarily what happens is there can be when they do the full blood cell count, often many of the cells can reduce, not neutrophils, but certainly lymphocytes. So it helped to protect against that. Also helped to protect the spleen. This splenic weight remained constant, and was quite protective of the bone marrow. It wasn't the hypocellularity that would that didn't happen when they looked at in this study. So the mice that were given the Biobran, they didn't suffer in that way. Their bone marrows were more protected, their spleen was more protected, their full blood cell count was better. So it's an interesting kind of study. Obviously, it'd be great to build on that, but it's something that we can use if our patients are having radiation. Also, there are many things you can do. I do like to use Biobran. Also, you'd like to use snow fungus, which is a mushroom, also very protective. So I wanted obviously to leave some time for questions and answers. I'll just briefly maybe look at, I've got some case studies we can look at, just briefly go through this. This lady, a lovely lady I saw, she had diabetes type 2. She was 61. She had retinopathy and grade 3 invasive ductal carcinoma. It was estrogen negative, progesterone negative. Had high stress levels. I think a lot of the stress was probably coming from the diagnosis itself. When we looked at DNA adducts, certainly copper was one of them. So did a lot of work on that. Also silicones as well. So I kind of moved to all the sort of toiletries that have silicones and more into natural toiletries, natural makeup. So you still have all the beauty products you want, just different types. And there are many people filling gaps in the market there. We also looked at sort of balancing blood sugar levels as well by using things like bencotamine. What's interesting, we use Biobran. Biobran is also quite helpful for balancing blood sugar levels. There is a study about that. Also with this lady, got her to reduce alcohol consumption. I mean, alcohol consumption, again, is not particularly good for diabetes or for breast cancer. Alcohol is classed as a class 1 carcinogen, so it's good to reduce consumption. So this is some of the things that we use. We use binders for the heavy metals. We use Bravo yogurt suppositories. That has some useful immune components, immune modulators in there. And we use some mushrooms as well for really helping with blood sugar balance. And melatonin, because this lady hadn't been able to sleep for many, many years. And what we also used was the curcumin, because curcumin is really powerfully cytotoxic. Found when we've done testing at main track labs to see how cytotoxic certain products are against a patient's cancer cell cultures, curcumin came up constantly as being a really useful anti-cancer agent, directly cytotoxic. So I always like to use curcumin now. Second most effective thing was artemisia. So again, I like to use the artemisia to really get some good effects and really try to work on trying to reduce the cancer cell numbers. And you could just use that alongside mainstream medicine. It's not a problem. I want to leave some time for questions. Have some other studies, but I also like to just give you a chance to answer a few questions which I'll endeavour to answer. I mean, just last one I'll just mention. This is a triple negative carcinoma. So this is some of the testing we did. This lady was on Biobran as well. She was tested for things like CMV, the herpes simplex, virus 1 and 2. and we did a provoked heavy metal test, and also wanted to test for iodine, because low iodine is also a risk factor in breast cancer. And Lugol's iodine is lovely to address it if that comes back as being an issue. So I think without further ado, I'd just like to look at some questions. I do think it's good to, if you're at high risk, the question here is, do you think we should test if we are at high risk of breast cancer? I do think that's a good idea, just to see, whether you have those genes, if it runs in your family. I think it's a great idea. I don't think you should be crushed by those results if they come back positive. I would then see, what other issues are there. You could do a generic test like an FDX test to see whether you have any deficiencies, how your immune system's functioning. So you can start putting things right at the beginning at an early age. So yes, I think it's a good idea. Another lady has said, how long would you use this protocol for during cancer treatment? What I would do is just keep looking at what's going on with the patient. I would use that as the guide, rather than say, oh, I would put this patient on it for a year, or I'd put this patient on it for 6 months, or just while on chemotherapy. I would always be guided by testing. And I found Main Track Labs do a fantastic test which will chart your patient's whole kind of cancer journey. It's good if you can get a baseline measurement, and that literally looks at something called EpCAM, which is strongly expressed in breast cancer, and also it looks at how many circulating cancer cells there are, and then I would be guided by how long you do the cancer treatment for, by that kind of testing, and also any testing that mainstream medicine is doing as well, so you can put the two together. The beauty of doing the main track testing is that it can look at small changes, and it's not invasive in any way. Yes, somebody said, how about zeolite for removing heavy metals? Absolutely love it. I use it all the time. So I definitely would use zeolite for removing heavy metals. So that I think it's a really good idea. I mean, I probably do sometimes a bit of depending how many heavy metals are found. You sometimes, do the zeolite, maybe do some chlorella. NDF I like because it's in nanocolloidal form, but yes, definitely zeolite. Yeah, so the sensitive test for viruses, Laura has asked, can you name what are the sensitive tests for viruses? So the ELISpots that Armin Lab do are really sensitive. So I would definitely do an ELISpot if you can, especially if the immune system is undermined. Any research on aluminium in deodorants? Yeah, there's a lot of research on aluminium. So maybe if you contact us, we can just send you some links. And yeah, aluminium is clearly sort of marked in many deodorants. If you go to a sort of like Whole Foods store or Holland and Barrett, you should be able to get aluminium-free deodorants. But you just have to make that conscious effort to look. I know Tom's of Maine, I think theirs is aluminium-free as well. Yes, another lady has said, do infections like EBV make you more susceptible to breast cancer? Definitely, and this is something that Dr. Schwartzbach at Armin Labs has also noted, many papers on this. Epstein-Barr, I mean, we've all probably been exposed to Epstein-Barr from the age of 2. So you could say, oh, are we all susceptible to breast cancer? But I think that's the beauty of doing the testing, is if somebody comes in as, just having latent Epstein-Barr at low level, I'd say, what's the big deal? That's not the driving force. But if somebody does a test and it has really high levels of lytic Epstein-Barr, you know, sometimes you even see like 300, 325, which is huge. You know, most people will be coming in at sort of 3 or 5 or something like that. These are my cohort of sick patients, my generic cohort of sick patients, not my breast cancer patients necessarily. But yes, so certainly if you've got high levels, then EBV definitely needs to be addressed. And I would use things like Viabram, but I would also use some antiviral herbs as well, like Fuja, like Neem, Angiographis, Chinese skullcap. All those things would be wonderful. Oh yes, definitely. Somebody else has said, are natural hair dyes like henna safer than permanent hair dyes? Yes, certainly they are. Henna would be fine. If you don't want to be a redhead, then Aveda do some really lovely hair dyes that are non-toxic. Would you prescribe melatonin supplements to women who have survived breast cancer, have difficulty staying asleep? Oh, definitely. I think melatonin is a really lovely investment in your well-being anyway, especially if you're having trouble getting to sleep. Such a common problem, and I don't know why it's particularly for women. You know, maybe we're just kind of juggling too many things. Maybe it's something more chemical-based, but I would definitely recommend melatonin. You can do the liposomal. Melatonin is lovely. Quicksilver do a good one. So melatonin would be is such a good investment. I think it's a bit of a youth juice, just to use a bit of colloquialism, but it's also nice and protective as well. I do probably recommend progesterone cream to many women, particularly women with breast cancer, but even women going through menopause or even perimenopausal, because like sometimes perimenopausal symptoms can go on for a decade where people are having hot flushes and stuff like that. So progesterone cream would be lovely, and also women with osteoporosis. So yes, progesterone for lots of people. I think it's a great thing for women. Somebody said they did gene training. BCRA was not included because they said it can't be modified. I suppose what you could do is just protect yourself from the susceptibility of being BCR the BRCA, BRCA1 positive. You could just, you know, just protect yourself from that susceptibility by, you know, reducing inflammation, getting a good diet, strengthening your immune system. So I think I have a few more questions. Somebody has said an interesting question. Do you use Viabram pre, post, or during chemo? Yes, it's really safe during chemotherapy as well. Doesn't interfere with anything, and you know, I have some. I've checked it with oncologists as well. I mainly do that with my children, some of my patients who are children. At Great Ormond Street, I do that more for legal purposes, but I've never had, it's usually actually the pharmacist at the hospital. I've never had a pharmacist at the hospital have a problem with Viabram. It just kind of just helps you, really. It doesn't interfere with the effectiveness of drugs, and what it does do is it protects you from the toxicity of many of the platinum-based drugs. Which is many of those platinum-based drugs are chemotherapy drugs. Anything that ends with the with platinum at the end of its name, and it also helps. It also works synergistically with danirubicin, a bit like the paclitaxel works synergistically with Viabram. Viabram sensitizes breast cancer cells to paclitaxel. firebrand also works in a similar way with danirubicin.
Juliet, did you want to just do one more question just to finish up for this evening, because it's getting close to 7:30?
Oh yes, yeah. Somebody said, do you work for Biobrand? I mean, Biobrand's a product, it's not a company. I don't work for the company that sells Biobrand products, but I do some lecturing for them. But I just work independently as a nutritional therapist. And I suppose I've been using it for 20 years, so I found it to be a useful aid. I think, so I'd just like to finish up by saying, just to ask you to email practitioners@healthy.co.uk for further support. That would be really good. And if you need any papers or any more information, then if you email practitioners@healthy.co.uk, they will be able to help you. I don't know, we've got 3 minutes, so maybe if I just say, I've got a few more questions. Somebody's asked, do you use Biobrand long term? I probably at some point would gradually taper off Biobrand eventually, or you could just use the pills just for support, but I would use the 1,000 milligram sachets initially when people are actually actively fighting cancer. Someone said, what is the name of the broad spectrum probiotic you mentioned? That is Micromax. I do like that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Juliet, for a very informative webinar. That brings this evening's webinar to an end. Thank you so much, Juliet, for a very informative webinar. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. We've had a really large group of practitioners on our webinar this evening, so it's great to have so many of you dialing in. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you so much again, Juliet.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
No problem at all. Have a great evening. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.